Welcome to Construction Genius. This is Eric Anderton. My guest today is Eric Jones, the president and CEO of Foushée Construction. They're a general contractor out of the Seattle area. Eric and I have a very in-depth conversation today about his career in construction, how he started off as a project engineer, went through the project management route, and eventually became the president and CEO of Foushée in 2009. He is a second generation owner of the company. The business started with Jeff Foushée in the late 70s. And we have a fascinating conversation about how he came into the president and CEO role, the different occurrences, the different situations that he went through on that journey to president and CEO, how he handled going through the 2008 to 2010 recession, lessons learned from that and the dot-com recession in the early 2000s that he's now applying as we go through the COVID situation as we're recording this in May of 2020. But regardless of when you listen to the podcast, the focus here is on how to go through succession planning successfully, how to build a successful career in construction, what you should be looking for in terms of if you're a president and CEO and you're looking for someone who could perhaps succeed you, what to look for in that ambitious project manager or estimator. And as a project manager or estimator, how to prepare yourself for future executive roles and having a realistic perspective on what it actually means to own a construction company, to be a partner in a construction company and take on that risk and responsibility. I say this with most of my interviews, but you're really going to like this one with Eric. And I would appreciate it if you please give us a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. You're going to want to take some notes here and you're going to want to share this interview with other people. It is that good. I really appreciate Eric taking the time to have this interview. We in fact committed to another interview 3 years from now because I'd like to keep track of how he goes through this transition that he's on at the moment. So enjoy my conversation with Eric. Thank you so much for listening to Construction Genius. Give me any feedback that you like via my website or on LinkedIn, and enjoy my conversation. This is Eric Anderton, and you're listening to Construction Genius, a leadership masterclass. Thomas Edison said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. If you're a construction leader, you know all about the perspiration, and this show is all about the 1% inspiration that you can add to your hard work to help you to improve your leadership. Eric, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Great to be here, Eric. Thank you.
I know you've been in construction for many years, and as the president and CEO of Foushée, you have a deep impact in your market up there in the Seattle area. How did you first get into construction?
Well, I guess this isn't terribly unique, but I was your consummate, tree fort builder as a kid. And so I had an inclination early on to liking the process. It was really a creative process that I was, in retrospect, attracted to. I liked seeing things come together, and a lot of that was use of my own hands. I remodeled homes, built new homes, decks, fences, that kind of thing through college. But I didn't even know. I started off completely differently, going to the Naval Academy prep school in Newport, Rhode Island, with every intention of becoming a naval officer. And that's not pertinent, but I shifted course, ended up at the University of Washington, and sophomore year just stumbled into somebody's room, and they were working on something that looked interesting to me. And I said, "What is your major?" And at the time, University of Washington called it BCon, or building construction. And that was the first I'd heard there was even such a thing you could major in.
Well, let me ask you this, though. I think it is interesting. What happened that you shifted from wanting to be a naval officer to moving out to Washington and eventually got into BCon?
Well, the simple answer is I broke my ankle. I was playing basketball for the Naval Academy prep school, and in a scrimmage, I broke my ankle, and the attending doctor said that continued participation in basketball may be a threat to my naval career. And at that point, I was not allowed to play basketball anymore until it healed. And it started me reflecting on what I really wanted to do. And I realized I did not want to be a naval officer. So I was kind of there for the wrong reasons, so to speak.
Interesting. And how old were you when you came to this realization?
18.
18-year-olds, some of them are reflective. Some of them have this kind of process, when they go through this process. What do you think it was about your upbringing, let's say, or your temperament that allowed you to go through this reflective process at 18 and realize, I actually don't want to be a naval officer. I want to do something different?
There's a little more to it. I was at the Naval Academy Prep School because my father attended the Naval Academy, and my uncle and he were roommates there. And it was kind of a foregone conclusion that the cousins all applied, or at least threw their hat in the ring. And so when you start that process, when you're 16 years old, my mindset was, well, I don't want to disappoint anybody. I'll play along, and then I just won't get in. I won't have to make a decision. And then the next thing you know, you're on a plane.
Interesting. To you, in your mind, was the broken ankle simply a confirmation to you of the fact that you didn't want to do it? Was it like a convenient or an easy out for you just because of the circumstance?
In retrospect, absolutely it was. I spent a lot of time because my parents' peer group is largely based upon people they met in the Navy. And I've been going to Army Navy games since I was a little kid. And there's something very attractive about that. And I love the water. I love being on the water. And so the Navy definitely wouldn't have been a bad route for me to take. But, again, when do you ask a young person what they want to be? And I don't know, at 15, 16, I think it's an unrealistic question. So as I said, I played along and I knew what I really loved to do. I just didn't really know. I remember telling my parents at a dinner table once that maybe I'd like to work in a cabinet shop. And I remember my mom, who's an art history major, by the way, saying, well, I think that would be wonderful. But my dad gave me a look like, really? I knew that the creative aspect of construction, which I had not put that together at the time. I did not understand the connection that I had between creativity and construction, nor did I see any pathway that would become a professional career.
I think that's one of the fascinating things about construction is how deeply creative it is at so many different levels.
Yes. And, since I became a project manager, so I started in that title in construction in 1993 when I joined Foushée, I was so wanting to capture and understand what I was doing because it's so visual, right? And so as a project manager, I'm not on site full time. Initially, I was doing small tenant improvement, remodels, and renovations. That we had no digital photography then, so I was taking still photos that I still have today in a drawer in my office, and I'm taking like 100, 150, depending on how big the project is, of photos a job and saving them. And then when I would see a similar job that I was estimating, I would go through those photos and say, oh, that's right, we did it that way, or that went before that. So much of construction, I remember trying to understand scheduling in college, and I go, well, I don't know what comes after concrete. And the professor would just say, just start, just put it together and start. Nobody's going to be right the first time. And I never really gravitated to that line of thinking because I didn't want to be wrong. But those pictures and those images that I was capturing were my way of recording early on what I was doing so that I wouldn't repeat a mistake again.
So hold on a second. So this is interesting. I just want to ask you one more question, going back to the decision around the Naval Academy. How did your father respond when you made the decision to not pursue the naval route and to move out to the West Coast?
He was really good about that. He was naturally disappointed. He shared with me openly that he saw himself reliving that experience through me, which is natural, right? That's the biggest fraternity in the world, and to have it meant a lot to him his entire life. He passed away 2 years ago last month. When he shared that with me, I thought, okay, he's being really open and honest, but I think he understood that because I told him I wasn't doing it for me, I was doing it for you. And he got that. We didn't have much longer discussions than that over it. Of course, at that point, I hadn't gotten into another college. I wasn't living at home. There was no indication of what I was going to do. That's where the conversation went to next.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Do you have children of your own?
I have 3, yes.
Anything you learned from that particular interaction that you've taken with you as you've been a father to your own kids? Just curious.
Yeah, sure. I mean, he never told me I had to go to the Naval Academy or even that I should, but it was an internally placed pressure that I put on myself to wanting to please, which I think a lot of people carry. I don't think that's a unique trait at all. Nobody wants to disappoint, especially a parent. And so I think both my wife and I, because we've talked a lot about this, have been very cognizant to encourage our children to follow their own paths. And two of my three kids are going into medicine. The third one is in commercial brokerage. So that none of them have seemingly chosen the same career path I did. And I don't think that's an accident. And you get asked that a lot as a president and CEO of a company. Well, are you going to let your kids come into the company? And I said, my kids have no interest in construction, and I've never encouraged them to do so.
So then you spent time when you were young. It sounds like you like to build the forts. You spent time in the summers when you were in college working in the field. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, I was a framer.
How important do you think was that field experience when you were young in terms of you understanding the construction process and then gaining credibility as you got out of college and came into a PM role?
It's important from the perspective that I got to two points there. It's important from the perspective that I got to socialize with most of the guys that I work with were 10 to 15 years older than me. And it was their path, right? They were blue collar construction workers. And on a construction site, I'd hang out with the mechanical guys, the electricians. I'd interface with all the trades. I was kind of curious who they were, what they were. And there was definitely a sense of, you stay in college. You don't want to do this the rest of your life. I was heavily encouraged to keep going to school, get your degree. And that stuck in my mind that these guys were not super, were exceptions, obviously, but I had enough, tips that you want to keep pushing through the other side of this. And so, that was important. Secondly, it helps build your credibility. And when you're putting together a resume as a young person, even if you only framed, in the summers for 2 or 3 years, that is something you can discuss at an interview. That is something you can put on your resume, and it definitely helped build an early resume.
So then you get out of college, you immediately got into project engineer, project management type roles?
Project engineer, yeah, I worked as an intern for the last 2 years of college for a large general contractor. Learned a lot there, more about what I didn't want to be involved in. It was more your old school, a lot of white shirts and ties, very quiet office environment. And I wasn't sure, it felt like a club. Wasn't sure that that's where I wanted to go. So it all becomes then the rest of my career, and even that opportunity became a connection to who I had met in college. And so I had another classmate that had graduated with me who called me on the phone and said, hey, we got an opening in the estimating department. You should come over and talk to this guy. And another local contractor, larger, been around a long time, went there. And I almost considered that experience. So I was at Howard S. Wright Construction for 3 years. Most in the estimating department, ended up as a project engineer on a bank branch building program. But I almost considered that like graduate school. We were estimating big stuff, Port of Seattle, big projects. And to be on an estimating team for 2 to 3 months, the technology was so different back then, but bid day was a big deal. And all those sub quotes coming in and calling them on the phone to a guy with a briefcase sized cell phone. And it taught me pressure, how to handle the pressure of a bid day by more or less watching the others. And then takeoff, right? I became the best quantity surveyor, estimator. I could, anything self-performed, I understood how we approached it, what our units were. And when I got to Foushée, which was at the time a much smaller contractor than I came from, that was the biggest skill I brought forward, is that I knew how to estimate.
So that's interesting. So you started off with a bit of practical experience framing. You got into project engineering, project management, had an opportunity to estimate. So sounds like you got a well-rounded background in construction as you built your career. Was this during your 20s, basically?
Exactly. Yep. In my early 20s, and so it all seems, in retrospect, to be a very short period of time. But when I ended up at Foushée, I certainly had the building blocks I needed to manage work independently. And Foushée very much, I don't know if you say we were lacking controls, but compared to the size and scale of the companies I came from, there was a lot less oversight, a lot less systems, a lot less process. There was no 3-ring binder that you had to memorize about our SOPs. It was basically, All right, there's a phone, here's a bid, good luck.
How did you like that in comparison? Were you relieved because you didn't have the shirts and the ties, or were you a little uncomfortable?
I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And it attracted me because, again, somebody left the previous company, came to Foushée, called me up and said, we have an opportunity. And that's how I got the shot at Foushée. And they colored in what kind of a company it was, since they also had worked for the previous. And they said, I think you're going to love it here. It's the old adage of you eat what you kill, and they give you a lot of rope. And I said, that's an opportunity, because I think I've got skills at that time that, if given a chance, I wanted to compete.
When was the point working with Foushée that you sort of stepped into a leadership role, or you not only were building projects, but then were responsible more for building teams or building people? When did that happen?
Well, the precursor to that was in probably 97, 98, somewhere in there. I got approached simultaneously by three opportunities. One of them was the same guy that brought me to Foushée had left about 6 months before and was starting his own company, and he wanted me to be his partner. Two others were to join other construction companies. One was much larger than Foushée, and one really would have been a parallel move. But the simultaneous effect of having to process, do I want to make a change? Do I want to move right now? And I said, you know what? I need to know what the future of my opportunity at Foushée is first. And so I went out to lunch with operations manager at the time, another real mentor of mine, guy by the name of Locke Anderson. And it was a little bit of a chicken move, because I should have just gone right to Jeff, but he intimidated me a little at the time. And Locke listened intently, and he didn't give me any reaction. He knew what I was asking. And then he scheduled a lunch with he and I and Jeff. In so many words, I wanted to know, would there be an opportunity to be a partner in Foushée? And Jeff's first question to me was, what does that mean to you? And my first thought was, I should have given that more thought, because you could see that question coming. And I answered it in a very canned manner, but it ended up being accurate. I knew that only the owners of Foushée had an opportunity to be the leaders of Foushée. And I wanted to know if at some point I could be more than a project manager, but be, there wasn't a ton of roles at the executive level then, but how do I get in one of those roles?
Let me ask you a question, just as in your thinking, as you were thinking about this idea of becoming a partner. At that time, did you appreciate, or did you think about this idea of the risk involved with that, in terms of, bringing on a project, signing your name, and, putting your house on the line, let's say? Did you think about those kinds of things?
Completely naive to it. Completely naive. And he tried to press upon me some of those risks and downsides, but at that point, my thinking was all blue sky. And I would worry about that when and if I got there. It was a pretty, so if you think about that, that was in 99-ish. And it wasn't until 10 years before I actually did it. So that was one of the other benefits of we called it G1 or G2, G1 transition. It took a decade.
And just for the audience, what do you mean by G1, G2?
We referred to G1 as Generation 1. And so as we worked on our planning around the transition, we just nicknamed it G2.
So you were part of G2, Jeff, G1. Let me ask you this then, just before we not miss this, but just move on. So let's say I'm a incumbent project manager, project executive, and I'm in a similar position to you back in the late 90s in terms of having offers on the table and opportunities, and wondering, in the current position you're in, what are the opportunities to take on partnership roles and things like that. How would you prepare? What advice would you give to that person in terms of preparing for the conversation with the incumbent leadership, the incumbent ownership?
I've had to answer that question several times, Eric, and my answer is, I don't care if you're a project manager, most of them are, or what your title in the company is, but are you the best of your peers? Are you the best project manager you can be right now? Because that's essentially the only path you have is to excel at what's in front of you. And so my goal in those 10 years before I was given this opportunity was to be the best project manager. And that was not just the most profitable project manager. I wanted to create the best relationships. I wanted my customers saying, we will go ahead with this if we get him as our project manager again. That was more important really based upon the culture of Foushée. Obviously, we were not trying to lose money on projects, and I didn't, but the strength of those relationships and the ability to execute on the project. And then I gradually worked my way into more complex projects. So I took us into a different field. We were not doing as much. My real specialty ended up being automobile dealerships and speculative commercial office, mid and low rise office. And we were an industrial distribution warehouse contractor that had a very well regarded interiors department when I joined us.
So that's interesting. Let me just make sure that we've got a little bookmark here just for people listening. Number one, the quality of the relationships that you have with the clients, so that the clients are saying, I want to work with Eric. You're getting asked for. Number two, obviously you're making profit on your jobs, which means that you're executing those jobs well. I heard this is very important here. You had this sort of an entrepreneurial aspect to yourself where you brought the company into new markets that they hadn't previously been in. Now, was that the clients taking you there, or did you see the opportunity and go and develop that?
It was start small with an opportunity. So sometimes, in some cases, it was an architect that introduced me to a car dealer, and then we ended up doing, 8 projects with the guy over 10 years. In other cases, it was an introduction the company gave me to a developer that wanted to do an office building. And there's something very powerful about repetition in construction. It's difficult when you're trying to, we've been trying to get into medical biotech, and you get a lot, well, you just don't have the experience that your competition has. And I always dismiss that as, well, we've done this or that. But once you've done a dozen of something, then you really understand the intricacies between one and another. And so I really started studying, as I did multiple of the same product type, how they differed, what made one more efficient, what made one better for the end user. And not only did that make me more fluent in trying to understand their value on a conceptual basis, because everybody wants to know what it's going to cost before they've fully designed it, it made me infinitely better at selling it, because I could anticipate the things that the customer was going to need. And whether or not it was either of those product types, I became far better at selling that, given that I'd done so many of them.
This is key right here. So not only are you executing the work, but you're understanding the work, which enables you then to sell the work, which then I would imagine gives you credibility with the leadership of the organization, because not only can this guy build, but he can sell. And bringing those two things together is not necessarily skill sets that everybody has. Then let me ask you this. In your mind, in order to be that project manager who excels all the other project managers, how should that project manager be relating to folks who are doing to your supers and your subs and all those kinds of things? Obviously you want to have the client relationships, but what should the project manager be focusing on in terms of the folks who work for your company and the subs that you do business with, you being a general contractor?
Well, and the other tier that I would put in there is the project engineer role. So when I started at Foushée, we would have 1 or 2 project engineers. They would typically be assigned to the project managers that had larger jobs. And that we started, based upon our growth and the complexity of the work, we started to grow our project engineer ranks. And so one of the first responsibilities I was given was to hire project engineers, because I was a local product of a local university and had connections, and then to train them. And we had no training program for project engineers. It was team up with this guy, and it's 100% mentorship. So I developed Foushée education system formatted around training and orienting a project engineer. Given my workload, I was given multiple project engineers. It was really almost a mini business entity that I had created. And then they gave me the opportunity, because they said, well, we're not going to do it. And I think we had a controller that was responsible for it. And when she moved on, they came to me and said, Jeff and Locke came to me and said, how'd you like to be the office manager too? Office manager was the receptionist and maybe 3 or 4 project administrators, but I did not want to do that, Eric. And that was good too, just to be able to, because it wasn't as directly related to construction as I was used to. It was all about people and listening to their schedules and why I need to be 15 minutes late. And
so it's very interesting, because again, I think a couple of takeaways here for the audience is number one, if you're looking to transition your company to somebody, think about what Eric has just shared in terms of the types of people that you're looking for. You're looking for people who can execute, who are entrepreneurial, who have experience in perhaps hiring folks, building teams. And then if you are someone who has an aspiration to run a construction company or to be a partner, or you think that the guy who's at the top, he gets all the money, all the perks, all the bennies and all that kind of stuff, then think about what you can do to set yourself apart from the herd and make yourself someone who would stand out and have an opportunity perhaps to transition and be in that next generation of leadership and ownership in the organization. So with that in mind, tell us about how you got into what happened with the next steps in terms of you going into that leadership role and into that, beginning to transition into a partnership role. How did that all take place?
Well, like I said, that was about a 10-year process. And when we began that, somebody else was going to be the president, our former business development manager. He was slated to be the president, and I was going to be the operations manager. Our two founders were always very clear. They were going to step aside and retire together. They were not going to go out and stagger or in sequence. So we were essentially going to, the guy whose name is on the door and who started the company in 77, and then our operations manager who joined him in 78. So really was the operation manager was really the heart and soul connection in terms of our field operations.
And what time frame are we talking about here? What year was this?
That was in the early 2000s, 2004, 2005, our new business development manager on, and he was slated to take that role on. And when he was hired, one of the first things that Jeff said to me is, Eric, I think he can do my job. And that at the time, that had no negative impact on me. Like, oh, shoot, there goes my chance. I saw myself and my skill sets aligned with operations, and that was my goal and target. I never aspired at that point to be the president.
Oh, well, let me ask you this, though. But you said this, you'd been with the company since the since the mid 90s, correct?
93, yep.
And what precipitated this individual coming on in 2004, 2005?
Opportunity. Like, he was with McCarthy and they pulled out of our market, and so he was looking for a job, and Jeff had a connection to him, and best man available. He hired what he thought would be our previous business development manager had retired, and the opportunity presented to get this guy, and he brought him on board. He was a consummate professional, 20 years in our industry, knew everybody. I think at the time it made total sense that guy very likely could have been his successor, and so that checked a box.
But hold on a second. But prior to that hire coming on board, you were slated for what role were you slated for there?
I was slated at that time to shift from project management to run our interiors department, and we actually put that transition in place. The interiors manager was to move to business development. I was to move into his role. And we had executed that plan about 2 months before this individual was hired. When Jeff made that call, we had an announcement to the management team and then to the company that we're basically reversing course. And he's going back to his office, he's going back to his office, and we'll introduce our new guy next week.
Okay, so this is very interesting. Now, if I'm you, I'm just talking about me here. I might be a little bummed out that I was going to be this guy, and now just because this other guy's come in, that's going to be changing. How was that for you at that time?
Didn't bum me out at all. I was taking the opportunity presented to me to run the interiors department because it was seen as a transition to give me management experience of a department that would lead to, because I was younger than any of the management team. Every other person on the management team was 10 years older than me. So all you needed to do was do the math on birth dates today to understand that eventually I'm going to be the only person standing here. And so the transition path for me that was laid out was spend some time managing interiors, smaller projects, less risk, and then transition into the full operations role when Locke retired.
Okay, so then what did you learn from Jeff in how he took that decision, that change of course? Because for a leader, we see this even now as we're recording this during the COVID crisis. We see our leaders, political and all those kinds of guys, they get skin in the game with the decisions that they make, and it's really tough for them to change course because it makes them look bad. It makes them look that they were incorrect in their first decision. So what did you learn from Jeff about taking a major decision and then reversing that decision in a short period of time?
First of all, never lose sight of the fact that in the president or CEO position, you have to constantly be aware and open to the idea that you can make your organization better through addition. And he was clearly aware of that, because at that point, we had put years into a plan that he reversed in a couple weeks, because he thought there was a better athlete available in the draft. And he made that decision. And, you know, I don't know internally, because we didn't have these types of discussions, if he even gave any thought to how that was perceived in the company. He was a very confident individual, and I think he relied on his gut that was the right thing to do.
How very interesting. So it's interesting though, because we have this, we make decisions, and we have this idea that we have this idea of sunk costs, you know, and it may not be a money decision that we made, but maybe we've sunk our reputation into a particular decision. And because we've sunk our reputation into a decision, we're unwilling to change that decision because of how it might reflect on our reputation and what other people think about us.
Which is really ego, right? And he would always say on the management team, no ego. So when we'd have management retreats or monthly management all-day meetings, if he ever had a sense that somebody was making a decision on which direction we should go on around ego, and he would just look at the person and say, no ego. So his ego did not allow him to question that decision. And so he made that call and made that shift. How I personally reflected it was with relief. I really, really enjoyed project management at the time. I was really just getting in a groove, and I did not want to go away from it at that point. And so it gave me an opportunity to essentially be a project manager for another 5 years, which really benefited me going forward. I wasn't quite done with my schooling.
There you go. So it's interesting, because Jeff, on the one hand, had no ego, or he's willing to lay aside his ego. You as well were realistic. You understood that you perhaps had some time, you needed some more seasoning. And so that was something that you took into account in terms of how you responded to the decision that was made.
Yeah, whether or not you call it realistic or almost a degree of selfishness, right? I knew what I was really enjoying, and I was a little intimidated that I would be, because I came out of the interiors department. I managed interiors for my first 2 years at Foushée. I was not as excited about going back into that line of work. And so, yeah, it was realistic as well as a little selfish, right? I wanted to do something that I really, really wanted to do.
That's cool. That's cool. Well, thank you for being open with that. So let's fast forward. We're 2009. That's when you became the president, CEO of the company?
Yes, and that was a perfect time in retrospect, because 8 was a great year. 9 was our prepare for the slowdown year. We had enough carryover volume from 8 that 9 ended up being a better than average year. But certainly by then in the economy, you knew what was coming. We could see our backlog disappearing. And Jeff and Locke's transition was set up that they would physically relinquish their roles and positions within our office. And so we built a little building nearby for them, and they moved out of the building, which was great. They would still participate in management meetings, but they really weren't involved in the day-to-day operations of the company. They maintained their ownership position. So he was still the CEO, but I took on the president role. And initially, just because our workload was so low in 2010, I carried 2 roles. I was the president and the operations manager.
So let me stop you there. This is very interesting. You actually built a building for the 2 G1 folks so that they would not physically be in the building when you were stepping up and taking a leadership role.
We did. That was not our idea. That was their idea. It was extremely valuable, because I've watched this in other companies, peers at other companies. And as long as the person who everybody identifies as the leader, and in this case is the founder, is walking in the door every day, extremely difficult to shift everybody's allegiance to whoever has it by title and name anymore. And so when they walked out, it wasn't 6 months before that started. You started to feel that shifting just because they weren't around anymore.
So let me ask you this then. From what you can recall in the meetings, when you took on the president role, Jeff still had the CEO role. So I'm assuming, is he still involved in the weekly project meetings, or?
They were not involved in anything weekly or operationally. They were involved in the management of the company. So we met as a management team monthly. We had retreats annually. They still participated in all that, but day-to-day operations, they walked away from in 9.
Okay, so then in that participation in those meetings, and when they still had ownership, so I'm assuming you're buying them out at this point. Is that correct?
The ownership transition took place at the end of 2012. So we basically had, and I hate this term, but I created Microsoft project schedules that documented how this was going to go. The schedules that I prepared to show how this was all going to timeline together, the period from when we assumed the roles in the company to when we actually bought them out, that 3 years we called a dry run. I never liked that term because what inherent in the term dry run is the possibility that it may not work out. None of us ever carried a possibility. And certainly I never carried a possibility that this isn't going to work out. That's what took place from 2009 to 12. They were still watching, still had a real vested interest in how we did, obviously, because the two of them owned north of 80% of the company. The minority shareholders were the ones running it. But that was about a 3-year period. And then we transitioned them completely out of the company in 12.
Okay, so then let me ask you this while I don't forget. What did you learn from Jeff and from, what was the other gentleman's name?
Locke.
From Locke. What did you learn from Jeff and Locke that you are going to apply as you go through the transition from G2 to G3 in what, the next 10 years or so?
Well, we'll have to conclude in 10 years. And so if I'm using the timeline that was laid out to me, I should be starting it now.
Okay, so what are the principles that you're using in terms of setting them up for success with regards to what you've learned from how Jeff and Locke did it to begin with?
Well, from my peer groups and watching this in other contractors and companies, it's nothing terribly unique, but you cannot start this process too soon. You cannot plan for things that you don't know. And we had those, right? We had a shift where Jeff found a business development manager that he thought would make us better. That individual was at one point conceived to run the company, and then we switched course there and pivoted to me. We had a very key project manager, senior project manager, that could have played into this, that chose to move on. We probably had 3 or 4 things that would have fed into our transition that didn't happen in the way that we thought they would. And it helped very much to have a little bit more time to react to that, fall back and say, okay, what does plan B look like? And then tease that out and put that into place. So does it need to be a decade? I don't believe so. That was probably a little longer than really it needed to be. It all depends on the people and how many of those curveballs you're going to get. But I think 5 years would have been impossible.
Okay, so somewhere between 7 to 10 years then.
Correct.
And just that idea, the fundamental idea that just because you put a plan in place, be ready for all those curveballs in terms of economy, in terms of circumstances, in terms of people's decisions, will cause you to have to readjust your plan.
Correct.
When you got into that leadership role, it's interesting because you got into the leadership role as the economy was going down. How did you manage the company through the last downturn? From what for you guys, was it like 2010 to 13, something like that?
We bottomed out in 10 and 11, and we started the slow climb in 12. So really we had 2 really rough years, and those were my first 2.5 years of the company were really tough. But you know what? That was great. That was really, really good. And I hate to be too cynical about this, but when you're new in a role, and obviously there were other people in the company that probably wanted the opportunity that I had, right? And so you're going to have that issue to deal with, as well as just like we were 6 months ago. We'll see what it's like in the next 6 months. We were really struggling to find people in that 2006, 7, and 8 market, right? We were struggling to hang on to our good people, and we were struggling to find more good people. So all of a sudden in 2009, everybody really was thankful for their job, and I didn't have to deal with that. That was really nice, right? And so you could rally the group around a cause, which is really valuable for somebody in a new role like that. I did not realize it at the time, but the ability to, because obviously we survived it and things went on, but the ability to be with a group and see that happen built a bond that was very valuable for me. And it was also very valuable for me because it brings fear I didn't want to fail. I didn't want to show Jeff that I couldn't do this. I didn't want to show the rest of the company. And I think it's very valuable to have a little bit of fear each day. It's one of the things that I've commented about our current crisis. My management team today, as you well know, is in their 30s and 40s. And for most of their career, we've had a pretty good run. This crisis has brought fear, and it's the fear of the unknown.
Let me just throw out something here to you. Just reflect on this for a minute. Going back to your basketball days at Naval Prep School and how the broken ankle gave you an open door there to go a different way. You take on this role as the president and the CEO of Foushée. You take on an ownership role. The circumstances of the Great Recession are upon you. And what's interesting is that doesn't drive you away, but it causes you to press into the circumstance and embrace the circumstance. So it's interesting about that when there's a different level of commitment that we have or a different desire that we have to do something, how that affects the way we respond to the challenges that we face.
And I guess the word I would add in there is passion, because I was being driven by a passion. The rest of it kind of came with it, but I had a focus in both of the examples that you've used, which I've never actually tied together like that, but it makes sense. I was following a passion, and as much as anything, that's what I've tried to push on my kids, right? Which again, isn't terribly unique. When you look back at your own experience, it was not something I was doing just because I thought there would be an opportunity or I thought that I wanted to lead a company. I was doing it because I really enjoyed it and had a passion for it. And that's what was driving me.
Right now, we're recording this in May of 2020. So it's so interesting because, human beings, we forget so quickly. Since 13, it's been like, boom, everyone's been awesome. The economy's been rocking and rolling up where you are, man. I mean, Seattle has just been going crazy. And all of a sudden, March 2020, here we go, COVID. What did you learn in that last downturn that you've been using and applying as you go through the current COVID situation?
Well, I think the largest thing is they're very, very different. There's nothing at all similar to the obvious factors that have led us to these two downturns, but it's a belief that, so the first downturn that I really experienced where the company was really razor thin of not making any profit. So in the .com, and I was definitely a part of it. So in the 2002 .com bubble burst, we were heavily invested in suburban office. And a lot of the suburban offices were being occupied .com companies, and that market went away completely. We had to pivot big time. We were not near as diversified back then as we are today. That hurt us. And so being on the management team in 2002, I think we didn't see any profit on our income statement and balance sheets until middle of the summer. And meeting every month and looking at those figures and seeing that bottom right-hand number be red, very unsettling, very unsettling. As you come out of these various episodes in your career, you realize that there is going to be a path around this. Some companies, as in both of those cases, Great Recession and .com, did not. So, but most of them did. Most of our competitors made it through that. And so why did they? Why do I feel confident Foushée will? Well, I think it's a benefit that everybody get a little fear around this because the COVID one is so much different than any others. I mean, it could well be the hardest one to recover from, but you will, right? And so there's that faith and optimism, and I guess I've always been a naturally optimistic person, that if you project a sense that this is going to be okay, we have Zoom calls now, right? Because we can't meet in person. And one of the things that I always try and press upon the folks that are still on salary is, we're going to be okay here. You're working for a company that's well positioned. Our balance sheet is in good shape. Our backlog has been impacted, but it hasn't disappeared. It's sort of preaching that it's that balance between spooking people and letting them know that they should be comfortable that they're at the right spot.
I do like this fear element that is now back in the companies in sense of, and it's good fear. It's like, hey, I got to get my stuff together and I got to perform because I don't necessarily have a job guaranteed to me as a result of the economic impact that we're facing. I think that is just it's a very healthy thing for the construction industry.
And people can say that when it's like nature, right? If all we had was spring and summer, everything would grow to the moon, right? And so you need to have that cycle of fall and winter to kind of create a rhythm. And when we have a market, the negative way of looking at a market that stays strong for a long period like we had is that people will say, well, folks just get greedy. I don't believe they get greedy as much as they get lazy. You just don't have to work as hard. You do not have to cross every T and negotiate a trade discount with a vendor or ask the superintendent, hey, why aren't you collecting your curb stakes rather than returning them and just letting them go in the dump? There's all kinds of little things in construction that the cumulative effect can make us significantly more efficient, but people just don't pay attention to it because they know that there's another job right around the corner.
That's right. What would you say are, the .com, the 08, 09, 10, and now COVID, they're all different, but what are the things in terms of leadership that don't change in terms of how you as a leader are showing up, what you learned from the folks that you were observing at the time leading through the company, what you learned through 08, and what you're bringing into 2020 now?
Well, the biggest benefit that I have that Jeff Foushée didn't is that I had him in my background, right? And so I can draw on what I witnessed from him definitely in '08. And when I started here, things were not great in this economy in the early '90s. I didn't have any context at all. And Foushée has always been, and the culture, and he led this, always very frugal, right? For a company of our size, we don't have a yard. We don't own our own equipment. There was always an establishment. We were preparing for a downturn, right? Even if times were good, we were preparing for a downturn. A perk to our carpenters is at the end of the job, the floor and lumber is yours. Take it home, build a shed, burn it for firewood. We're not going to bring it back and store it in a yard and pay somebody to manage it and collect it. I used to sometimes look at couldn't it be more efficient if rather than we rented a forklift for a year and a half, we bought it? And then he would always say, and then who's going to take care of it? We set ourselves up always to play in the down part of the inning. That benefits you when you get there big time. So he gave me that, which I'm grateful for. And then I don't think he would admit this, he was a different type of a communicator than I am. I remember being a project manager and wondering what the direction of the company was. I wonder what the management team thinks about this. I wonder what their sense is. And in some cases, even if they don't have the direct answer, which nobody has the answer right now, what is something going to cost in 6 months? We don't know. We got to wait till we get there. I have, in this particular one, which is even more challenging because it's virtual, I've just tried to, whether it's pick up the phone and call a superintendent, hey, how's it going that I laid off? I mean, we put on standby guys that have been with the company for 35 years. And, you hope it's temporary and they're already back. So it was. Picking up the phone and call them at home and say, what are you working on? They're all working around the house. Trying to create and maintain that connection. We had a superintendent that had a medical condition. We went to his house and helped his wife and daughter spread some mulch. Those types of things, not that Jeff wouldn't have done them, they've just been really impressed upon me as a way to maintain the culture that I want.
So that's interesting because even though you've got some folks who are not working or even folks that you laid off during the COVID situation, your emphasis there was continuing to maintain those relationships with a view to how you might be able to use them or how they might be able to work with you in the future.
Correct. Because my optimistic attitude is we're going to need them all back. And I don't want anybody to feel that they're not wanted and that there's not a spot here. So as a management team, and I was included in that, let's stay in touch with these folks. Let's communicate. The number of emails that extremely talented CFO and I crafted to just communicate, and it became a flood because everybody was doing the same thing. But to communicate to our team about what we were doing, how we were handling this, how we were navigating through this, maze of phases and mandates and what's an essential service. Very complicated, but to not communicate anything to me would add to the anxiety. I was trying to relieve and calm people, and I created a rally cry, right? You know where that come from. And I'm a music guy. So I picked up Pink Floyd, Bring the Boys Back Home. And of course, I put brackets after it and said, and girls. Before or after every Zoom call, I'd play that song, right? Not only was the tune emblematic of what we were trying to deal with because it's so grand and big, but I was trying to send the message that we're going to bring this team back together and continue to do what we're doing and continue to grow and create opportunity.
So it's interesting because on the one hand, you have this very pragmatic business philosophy of low overhead that has enabled you to have a strong balance sheet. But on the other hand, you have the more sort of human side of it where you want to make sure that you're staying connected with folks, even if they're not directly working, and projecting that optimism through the difficult situations with a view to the fact that, hey, we may be here right now, but we're planning on being up here and we're going to be ready to go there once the economy picks up again.
Yeah, I guess it's an interesting fence to straddle, but that's probably how I would put it. None of this you do alone. This call is about my experience, but I have an exceedingly exceptional team around me. Our safety manager has just been exceptional through this whole thing, and our field safety manager, because so much of the COVID thing is obviously related to health. Wouldn't have been able to do any of this without those guys' guidance, and I could name the rest of them, but it's a team effort, and you're there to kind of assure the team and make decisions and help further the cause. It's just very strange when you go from a company of 106 one week to 20 the next week, and you're a construction company which has to be putting work in place to survive, and you have no operations by order, by law.
Yep. Yep. As we look forward here, I want to just leave the audience here with some takeaways. As you're working through the transition, and again, you've gotten ahead of the game, so you've got a 10-year run here in terms of working through the transition. What are 3 pieces of advice that you would give to someone in your position, the president or CEO of a company, as they're looking to transition to the next generation? What are 3 pieces of advice for them, please?
Give it time, and that's going to be an individual thing, but as you and I captured, I would give it 7 to 10 years. The other shift we didn't talk about as much is why we pivoted from the gentleman that we hired to take over our business development operations in mid-2000 to me. And one of the real keys there, which Jeff was very open with me about, was my age. So as you're looking at your ranks, you do not want to pick people that are really close to your same age, because this needs to be balanced with skill sets and everything else. But picking people to transition to that are similar to your own age just limits the amount of time they're going to be able to lead the company. So by picking somebody in my age bracket, which carries its own set of risks, I think Jeff knew that, I could have a 20-year run, which was also going to be in the benefit of the company. Be prepared, as we talked about, for things not to go as planned, which feed directly to the time frame. And I guess the third one, which is more about me, is I had no idea that it was going to be as hard as it was. And that came from my optimism, because you're generally probably being looked at because you're, as we talked about, you're good at something in the organization. So I was a good project manager. Well, good project managers can make it look real easy, just like any other activity. And I let that kind of go to my head. I thought, well, I can create these relationships, and that's obviously key to business development. And I know how to hire and train project engineers. And how can that be any really different than hiring and training project managers? I had no idea how many parts would be moving once it all comes to you and it's all your responsibility. And so the awareness of that, and when you're talking to somebody that you think you may have identified that can fill this role, I've given a lot of thought, because I'm doing the same, obviously, is how I communicate that in such a way to understand if he really wants it or she really wants it, or if it's just, hey, I just see the benefits that come with it and it looks like the top of the pyramid, and that's why I got my hand up.
Yep. Yeah, so you have to be realistic with those folks and really not sugarcoat the opportunity. All right, so those are some real takeaways there, and I hope if you're listening to this episode, you are taking some notes. As we wrap up here, Eric, I really appreciate your time. I'd like to end on a note that I like to ask my guests, and that is, what's your favorite place to eat in Seattle?
Thai ginger. I'm a big Thai food. Spicier the better. Seems there's a commonality. I've heard other people on your podcast say the same thing, but there's a, there's a chain with a store not a mile from our house. It's the other thing about this role is I used to go there with other project managers. Now I find myself going there by myself quite a bit and sitting at the counter, and I think it's 1 to 4 stars, and I ask for 5.
5 stars. That's the heat. That's the heat rating. So that's Thai ginger. We'll link to that in the show notes. Eric, I really appreciate your generosity here. This has been a very, very insightful conversation. I do wish you the best as you continue to move forward. You know what I think we should do is we need to get another episode in like 3 years from now and see how the progress has been going. That'll be very interesting.
Very interesting to compare them. Yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome. Thanks for your time, man.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Construction Genius. Hope you found that 1% of inspiration to help you in the next few days. If you like the show, please give us a 5-star review on iTunes, share it with other construction leaders who you think would benefit, and always remember that the show is brought to you by Kick-Ass Meetings. I've been working with construction leaders since 2004, teaching them how to run extremely effective problem-solving meetings that gets their people collaborating, taps into their creativity, and to get yourself a free copy of the Kick-Ass Meeting Report, go to www.ericanderton.com/kickassmeetings. Grab yourself that free report, read it, use it in your business. You'll find it extremely useful. And thanks again for listening.